All right. We are live. Thank you so much to everyone who is joining us today. Welcome to our Students for Liberty webinar. Today we are having our special guests, Katherine Mangu-Ward, who will be interviewing Alexander Kvitashvili. Katherine Mangu-Ward is an editor-in-chief at Reason and a member of the board of directors at Students for Liberty. And Alexander Kvitashvili is a former Minister of Healthcare for Georgia and Ukraine and a consultant with the World Health Organization. And today they're going to talk with Students for Liberty about how free markets drive innovation. And it is our great pleasure to have both of you here today. Thank you, Katherine and Alexander, for taking your time to join us. And I give the floor to you, Katherine. Please, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with Students for Liberty. It's an organization that I think just does incredible work all around the world. And I'm honored to be on the board and always excited to help start and continue an interesting discussion about the role of free markets. And thank you so much, Alexander, for joining me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for having me. I'm really excited. It's a wonderful group of people, amazingly nice and interesting organization. And liberty is the word that I've been striving for throughout my career and my personal life. So happy to be here.
I have to say, as an interviewer, the first thing you do, even when you know who someone is go look at their Wikipedia page. And so, of course, I went to your Wikipedia page before this event, and yours has a very unusual structure. I don't think there's a lot of people who need a whole section for being Minister of Health in multiple nations, right? This is a pretty rare honor, a pretty rare achievement. I absolutely want to get into the sort of fascinating story of your career in a little bit, but if you will indulge me, first, I would love to just start at the theoretical level. I often find when I'm talking about healthcare in particular, with even with other libertarians or with people who are maybe sympathetic to free market classical liberal ideas, they say, okay, well, what would it look like? What does a genuinely free market healthcare system look like? And I struggle to answer that question because we are so far from that vision in so many ways, certainly in the United States, but around the world as well. So I wonder if you could just start like at the very most theoretical level. What do you see as the role of markets in healthcare, and what would a free market or genuinely open system really look like to you?
Okay, well, that's one tough opening question.
It's a small question. It's a small question.
The question is small, but the answer will be, I'll try to be brief. To me, I think the whole issue with having free market influencing the quality of healthcare delivery or healthcare service delivery hits this brick wall because people, when there's something unknown to most of the population, and healthcare and medicine is something that you have to study for 15, 20 years to actually be able to make a decision on your own. When you are in that realm and you are a majority of population, the minority who are the doctors, healthcare professionals, they run the business, let's put it that way, and you know very little. Healthcare is as much of a business as anything else. And this is the first misconception that people have, that no, healthcare is something that has to be guaranteed by the state, guaranteed from my taxpayer contributions, and it's a kind of a God-given right of some sort. Okay, so I can be a smoker, a drunk, whatever. I mean, I could live the worst with the worst habits of lifestyle and so forth, but still someone has to take care of me. So that's one thing. And just to give you a very quick example, 20 years ago or 25 years ago, if anybody would tell you that there'll be a private company launching rockets into space, no one would even consider you as. And then people realized that, wait a minute, this could be outsourced. I mean, we are spending 10 times more money on setting up something which can be done through the competition, through higher quality, faster, and a lot cheaper, and not using that much of taxpayers' money as they were used before. So this is what's happening, and COVID actually has really pushed that a little bit. the states have realized and understood that you cannot really contain that type of approach where a state is a guarantor of every kind of service delivery for free for everyone. Okay, first of all, there's no country that does that. I mean, I'm not everything I'm going to say is not going to involve, and please don't ask me any questions about Belarus, North Korea, and Cuba. Okay, they don't have health systems. That's whatever they have, it's not known. And I know this fascination in the U.S. about the Cuban healthcare system, but people make another second fundamental mistake. There's a big difference between medicine as a science. So when the actual doctor does something or surgery or whatever, that's part of the science. And then there is organization of healthcare, which is not a science of medicine. It's a managerial science. If you look at different countries and how every circle of healthcare system functions and who manages them, mostly you have doctors or healthcare professionals that are running hospitals, clinics, or even health systems in general. Georgia actually made I think it was the first, I don't know, I mean, I could be wrong, but I was the second minister of health in the country which didn't have background in medicine whatsoever. I mean, I did work in health economics, health financing, and so forth, but I didn't have any practical knowledge of medicine. And that should not be a prerequisite. I'm not saying that doctors should not become managers. That's not the point. But I'm saying that it's not a dying necessity to have a medical background to be a manager. In between of these two ministerial positions, I was also a rector of the university, the dean. And I didn't teach, I'm not a professor because I was a manager. And then it depends how you manage it. The country of Georgia between 2005 and 2012 was managed as a private company, pretty much. I mean, we didn't have any established working hours, we didn't have pensions, we didn't have overtime, anything of that sort. We were just doing our things and we were pushing the country as fast as we could forward, especially in healthcare. And I know I'm getting off the theory, but so when we realize that there are theoretical aspects that people do not look at healthcare as a business, which could be generating pretty good profits, it's a morally good business because you are doing something really good to the society. If you're treating people and you make sick people healthier, right, or healthy. And what you do, if you organize the system properly and you have state involvement as part of a player in the market, as a purchaser of goods, then at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter who the service delivery owner is. Whether it's better not to be state because state-owned companies, as we all know, they simply don't function properly. They don't work properly because there's no interest into expanding and running. So what we try to do, we try to understand the theoretical problems that we had, that people perceived healthcare as a God-given right, which had to be guaranteed in full by the state. And the second, that people didn't look at the healthcare as a good business. So when we combined that and we did the massive privatization of healthcare system in the country, and in the result, and we're not going to get into that because it's a long story. But what at the end, what we received was a state as the largest purchaser of goods through direct procurement or procurement through private insurance companies, still was the largest player in the market because the out-of-pocket contributions or people that paid from directly into the hospitals were not that high. Still managed to run the system. So that's the problem, that people start to believe that theoretically there's certain things that have to be taken care of by the state only, and you as a taxpayer, you are willing given to contribute to that, and but you have to get 100% for free, everything, the best of the best, and so forth and so forth. So that's what usually the perception of the healthcare systems are in the world. And now during the COVID and after the COVID, we'll see those big transformations in the approach in general. We're already seeing that because we only have private companies coming up with vaccines. Well, except the Russian, yeah.
Let's talk about that, because I think any panel on healthcare period at this time is going to have a big COVID chunk in it. I think it's unavoidable. Yeah. And it's certainly a fascinating case study, as you say. In some ways, I would say the story of COVID has been a story of some really stunning health innovation, just absolutely incredible leaps forward, advances in vaccination technology, but also potentially in some, tracking events, other things as well. And at the same time, I think it's fair to say that in many ways, it's also been a story of government failure, or at least serious government missteps, many of them. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about either from your current perch at the WHO, or from your experience as a Minister of Health, how can those two things exist side by side? How can it be that we got this so right and so wrong at the same time? And what you think that bodes for the future? You said we're sort of poised for some big changes. What do you see coming in the future in response to what we've learned from COVID?
I think COVID is going to be that impetus and that force that will bring private business into the healthcare in general worldwide. Not just, for example, well, I mean, US is not the best example, but for example, if you look at the healthcare system in the US, you still don't have a single purchaser system. I mean, some things that have been adopted in different countries. Now they're talking about that. They started talking about during COVID. But at the same time, I believe that participation of private companies in research and researching and developing new medicines or vaccines or whatever, but simply to be part of this whole process, it's going to become inevitable, because there's not enough money. There's no country in the world that has enough money to deal with these things. If you look at the dynamics, what happened in different countries, this is really interesting. Maybe in a year we'll have some good reading materials. Very practical cases, looking at how different countries cope with that things. Italian healthcare was considered probably third or fourth best in the world, and that was the first one that failed. Spanish was also considered, and French. Socially oriented, almost like universal health coverage, everything or larger portion of it paid for by the state, and so forth and so forth. And if you look at the dynamics, the countries that had, Ukraine is a unique example, and I can bring that up too, because I think Ukraine managed the crisis exceptionally well. I mean, there are lots of critics, but I mean, my position is that they did a really good job because they managed it properly. And because the state didn't have enough money, because there's a process of transformation of the system. But if you look at the trends, usually countries from the former Soviet bloc, and we're not talking about Eastern Europe countries, because I don't consider them as part of Soviet Union. They didn't have enough time under the horrifying rule to completely degenerate in terms of mentality. But because Czech Republic failed miserably also with COVID. But if you look at countries like Ukraine, for example, or Azerbaijan or Armenia, or some of the Central Asian states, and Russia too. I mean, there's not much of information that comes out of there that I necessarily believe in. But these countries managed to get hold of the process at pretty early in the stage for two reasons. I believe one is because of but this is my personal view, and I don't consult WHO on this kind of things. I'm happy to share this with you. First, because of the state of the infrastructure. It's very simple. My first horror moment was when I realized that if I get this thing, I'll end up in the infectious disease hospital somewhere in Ukraine. And trust me, that is not the site. That is not something you would want to do. And most of the people thought, because people were extremely careful, very careful. Masks, sanitizers. I don't know how many tons they sold per day of those things, but obviously there was a public, very cautious approach to these things, right? Second is that we were genetically prepared. I'm 50 years old, so I remember Soviet Union very well. We were prepared, and we have this in our genes, generation of genes, that something terrible will happen. It's going to be a war, it's going to be this. We're always prepared for something horrifying, something that would lock us up at homes, or go into the bunkers, or go up in the mountains and hide from NATO invasion, or some garbage like that. And people had this subconscious preparedness for this kind of things, which in Western Europe, in comparison, they didn't have that. It's a very relaxed society in general. And if you remember the first few years back, I think 5 or 6 years back, the first signs of issues with Western health systems were noticeable when there was a big influx of Syrian refugees. Do you remember? It was like big, few thousand, I mean, tens of thousands of people. And the systems were not ready to absorb and to treat and take care and so forth. So many countries, including Sweden, which is considered the most socialist country, or whatever you want to call it, they start to realize that, yes, we're rich countries, but the way our health systems are organized are not necessarily efficient. I'm not talking about quality of medicine. This is completely different. We're talking about management and the organization of health systems. They're not efficient. They're not effective. They're extremely costly. And we need to come up with something. And once they start to look at the options, for example, outsourcing is not the good word for health, but purchasing certain types or certain number of services from the private providers, not just pharmaceuticals, but private hospitals, private clinics, that turned out to be cheaper for the state. It turned out to be because, at minimum, there was no capital investment from the state side. Okay, you say I'm going to pay $10 million, for example, for I don't know, every Swede can get heart surgery if they need to on the expense of the government, but you go to the private clinics, for example, and then people start coming in and start investing into this network, and they realize that this is a good money that they can earn. And state stays away from capex and capital investments, capital expenditures, operational costs, and they simply direct their money directly for their service provision. I think we will see this trend a lot more because COVID showed not only issues with, I'm going to say terrible thing, but I hope you'll get me wrong. This kind of stressful situations happen, probably once in 100 years. And as usual, as a result of these kind of situations, a lot of investments happen after that. First, the world was changed, and the biggest one I can remember 100 years back, that was the Spanish flu, so-called, and that actually changed the world, and not just the health system, but the world started to function. And we will expect something like that. And that crisis resulted into a huge advancement in medical sciences and in pharmaceutical sciences. Another example, non-health related, this whole Soviet US Star Wars program, whether you are pro-Reagan, not pro-Reagan, just forget about politics. We're talking about something that the Americans came up with. The Soviets couldn't catch up. And then, we all know all the stories, but that's not the component I would like to concentrate on. That arms war, or whatever you want to call it, that whole space thing, resulted in a breakthrough in technologies that we have today. That was from coming up with foil paper that we use in everyday's life as a consumable good, and not just to internet, to what. So there are certain stressful environments that create a big push for some kind of developments. And I think this, and of course, it's taking people's lives, and it's a horrible thing. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying that this will definitely result in some kind of eruption of, I believe, in two directions. One is medical sciences and pharmaceutical sciences, and that's all private. Pharmaceuticals are all private. And second will be the changing of organization of healthcare, or how countries manage their healthcare systems in their countries respectively.
I wonder if we could come back a little bit to your point about the culture component of handling COVID and the response to COVID restrictions. Because on the one hand, I think that's a very interesting insight, that there are people who have been through, as nations, as individuals, who have been through some very dark times, and that prepares them both in terms of individual readiness and also in terms of maybe deference to the state, or the likelihood of whether or not they're going to listen to, say, a public health order. What is the practical lesson from that? Since obviously the lesson is not everyone should suffer horribly in order to learn to be prepared, although perhaps that is what has happened here. Maybe you could just speak a little more broadly, especially as someone who's worked, really in the trenches in two different nations with distinct, national character and distinct culture, how can we kind of thoughtfully incorporate the influence of culture in the design of health policy?
It's really funny, but 2 days ago, I was sitting, we were just discussing this, and we were just coming up with different examples, a bunch of friends of mine. Because if you look at from the social perspective and how the socium of, let's say, Georgians and the Italians, they're very identical. So like large families, they hang out with each other. It's a very, very knitted. Ukrainians are extremely sociable. They like to go out. They go to cafes and restaurants are full all the time here. They're also very sociable people. But I think, okay, this is, again, I could be completely wrong. These are my guesses. I think the fear of something is greater in our nations than the fear of something is greater among the French and the Spanish, because we were raised on fear. In general, we're raised on fear of something. It's not necessarily a war. Something terrible is going to happen at some point. First day of a month was always a horrible thing because they would come up with something really weird and they change the rules, or they do the financial reform and your 10 rubles would become 1 or something like that. So I don't know. So those I think that we were more, I wouldn't say resilient, but more prepared for this kind of for this kind of stressful situations. I don't know. It's really that's what I said, that you will need some time to look at look how things happened, and what were the why, for example, this whole thing happened in Lombardy and not in, let's say, I don't know, down in south in Italy, right? These are the things that we need to be answered, and I don't know. It's a good point, but these are just we're still at the stage of guessing. We don't really know anything for a fact, and maybe we won't ever know. But it's an interesting time that we live
in. I forgot to mention, and should mention now, that we are definitely taking questions from viewers. You can put your questions in the YouTube comments, and I will do my best to pull them out and address them here. So if you have questions, please drop them in. I'm actually going to go ahead and ask a first question, though I may resume moderator tyranny later and ask a couple more of my own. Somebody asks for your take on universal healthcare coverage in Georgia, starting back in 2013, and what you see the effects are in the long term.
Yeah, I pulled up the chat too, so I saw that question. Well, I tried to be as unbiased as possible. I think there was a huge mistake that was made in 2013. For me to explain that mistake, I can maybe it'll take me 40 seconds to explain the system that we left behind. The system was such that the state was buying insurance through private insurance companies for people that couldn't afford it, or for other social groups that needed to be insured. For example, teachers, police, army, and so forth and so forth. So by 2012, I think there were maybe little over 60% of population insured by the state through private insurance companies, and these people were receiving those were socially vulnerable groups, and they were receiving services through private network. In 2013, when there was 2012, when there was a change in power, the new government came with the promises of more social approach towards healthcare, or towards pretty much anything. And they pretty much said that, okay, well, there's 60% of people that are insured by the state, and the other 40% have this virtual state insurance, and all of you can go and get healthcare for free. Now, that I believe was a major mistake, because if they wanted to do something like that, they could have simply bought that other insurance for the other 40%. For example, I do this kind of weird thing. At least by doing so, they would control the expenditure side of the state budget. What happened was that when you calculate, and those of you that know how insurance functions, what you do, first thing you do, you calculate the risks. And the insurance system is pretty much risk aversion. So, for example, if you say that, I'm going to insure a family of 4, you may have one person at risk of you to cover for health services, and the other 3, I'm just theorizing, are the ones that are healthy, so they do not consume that much money from as a payment for the services. So that is extrapolated on a larger group of people. So larger group of people you have, better you manage the risks. So out of 1 million, the risks are better managed than out of 10,000. So more people you have on the insurance, better it is. And that's one. However, when you say that I will do everything for free for everyone, that's a different model. That means that you do it case by case. So you are paying hundreds, so you don't do risk pooling, and you pay for everything for 100%. Of course, after the 6 months or 8 months of implementation, and that was the first year when they switched or added the other people and type of universal health coverage, they ran out of money, which was to be expected. When they run out of money, and there's a minister's name, David Sergenko, mentioned there, and is a very, very good friend of mine for many years. So I'm not criticizing him personally. I'm just saying that this was the approach of the new powers to be there.
I definitely asked the question in that way to avoid putting you in the position of a person.
No. This is fine, because I get it. But this is, again, I mean, it's not just my personal opinion. This is what happened. So I'm just telling you the story. And they ran out of money, which subsequently meant that they couldn't pay the hospitals. And don't forget, 99% of hospitals are private. So then at the end of the day, the hospital said, you know what? We don't want to take these people with your state insurance because you don't pay. So we will not be treating them because, now we're, generating debts and so forth. As a result, the year after, they started to slash the programs. So, for example, I don't know if there are any guys with medical background, but for example, people with cataract would not be able to be treated under the state insurance program unless you were, 75 years old or something like that. I mean, they started to limit the payout levels and quantities. So then there was a next step, and this is the snowball starts rolling and things get worse and worse. So then you say, okay, I cannot deal with what they said. We cannot deal with private companies, private hospitals, because they refuse to take this patient. So what we're going to do? Build state ones, so we can treat people that we have insured or put them under the universal health coverage in our own hospital network. So unfortunately, Georgia, all of a sudden, I think they built 3 or 4 or 5, and then they stopped because they realized this is also consuming a lot of money and it's not efficient way to. And then they did a rollback. So they went a little bit back and kind of tried to go back to the system that was before these reforms. I think that was a mistake, and I think they should have done a little bit differently, not a little bit, but fairly differently in terms of simply going with the same mechanism. And just if the target was to cover the entire 100% of the population of Georgia with some kind of health services, then they should have just bought the health insurance products that were available in the market. That's to answer the first question.
Stories like these sometimes make me a little bit maybe fatalistic is too strong a word, but it seems that this story happens over and over, right? That once there's a certain amount of intervention and participation by the state in health insurance or healthcare markets, it's in the U.S. the conversation we had around the Affordable Care Act was the death spiral, which was similarly maybe slightly too dramatic term for this problem in which bad incentives in the system create the demand for more intervention, which in turn creates more bad incentives. Where do you see as kind of bright lines or specific policy interventions that can stop that? Are there sort of, assuming that you're not saying the government doesn't participate in the health sector at all, are there sort of clear places where you can say, as long as the state confines itself to these types of activities, there's a chance for success?
I think it will be extremely difficult to argue the point that government should not participate in healthcare at all. I would say that the government should, if there's a big if the government collects taxes, it should do something, okay? But not necessarily for everyone and for free. There are certain groups of the idea. Okay, look at the strata of poverty. Why do we need to deal with poverty issues? And I'm not talking about around the world. I'm just saying, let's say a country needs to do it. It's not because you're a socially oriented state, but you are someone that is responsible in responsible state for making a well-being of your population better. So you have more richer people, you have people that produce something and your country becomes richer. So okay, that's not a good word, but nothing comes to my mind. The handouts that usually governments give to poor people, they are not the ones that lift people out of poverty, okay? The investment into that should be as well planned and structured as investing as you would invest in stocks, because you're investing in people, which then will produce you a bigger good. Let's put it that way, right? So I think if the government collects taxes in addition to security and protection and whatever and police, then they should invest in bringing people out of poverty. And healthcare is one of the biggest determinants and one of the biggest factors that can put people who are middle class, higher middle class into a extreme poverty because of the so-called catastrophic health expenditures that people may have if they're not insured, and there's some kind of serious health issue. Then the families financially they sell houses, they do if there's a child involved and so forth. So there are two functions that the state has to assume. Again, I'm not socialist. I'm just if you collect taxes, first is to have a basic safety net, and second one is to lift people out of poverty, including financing some one way or another health expenditures, so that people can come out of this. Now, how you do that, that's a different story. There are two ways of doing. I'm not talking about Bismarckian models and let's not pollute your minds with some things that are theoretical. There are two ways. Either you pay for the demand or you pay for the supply. That's fairly understandable, right? Soviet Union and socialist countries used the model when they paid for supply. So I have 1 million people. I have some kind of, let's say, statistical data that these people are prone to this, and this. So I build X number of hospitals, clinics, whatever I need, what I use, and then I pay because I calculate number of beds that I need to serve this number of population. I pay hospitals directly per bed. Let's say $1 per bed per month, and we don't care, if you get like 5 patients or 5,000 patients, but this is what you get. That's when you pay for the supply. When you switch to demand demand model, right? There you have when you start paying for actual services. So you don't really care how many beds you do, but you don't really have to have X number of beds necessarily in this particular case, place. But you pay for actual services that are provided by hospitals, clinics, primary care clinics, and so forth. Now, in that, in demand side, you have several ways of doing this. You can do this universal health coverage thing, say that I'm going to pay for everything for everyone. Then you have also segmented. Then you can use private monies or private insurance companies. You can use specific programs. There are a lot of different models that you can employ. You cannot do that when you are paying for the supply. So. And then you can't really calculate whether the supply is good enough or nice enough. So I kind of lost my track. I don't know what we're talking about. I'm getting into whether it's possible. Okay, the other example that everybody will tell you, Israel. Israel has a system when they have 4 established 100 years ago or 40, 60 years ago, or since 48. Let's put it that way. I can't calculate. They established 4 insurance companies. So they have this mix of private and state, but the state financing for both, and then you can buy yourself an insurance and so forth. If you look at details, and because I've studied Israel, because we used lots of models that Israel employs in the healthcare organization, that sounds nice on paper, but then you'll see what happens. You'll see that the money that the state uses or spends for universal coverage let's say, for that part, right? They run out somewhere by July, August of every fiscal year. And then what happens? They reprogram it. They delay the interventions if they're planned surgeries, for example. Instead of 1 month, they push it to a month and a half. And as a result, at the end of the year, companies come back and say, we need another 15 or 20 million or whatever, X million to cover our losses. So what I'm trying to say that there's no well-probed or yet figured out model how to have that work and function. So everybody's trying their own. And that's when I was responding to the question about Georgia, I believe that the model that was built there, it did respond to the need that the country had then. When you had state as the major purchaser of the services, you had private companies that were providing services, you had insurance companies that were pulling the financial risks, so the state was not involved in it, and that should have continued. So that's, I don't know if I answered that. Wow, the other question is, gee.
Yeah, I was gonna actually skip ahead. We can come back to the next question, but we had another request that I thought was interesting, which is you just described a lot about how to allocate funds and allocate intervention into sort of existing known costs. But let's talk a little bit about the future and innovation, since that's part of our topic here today. Yeah. Where do you see healthcare startups moving in the future? Do you think that ultimately we'll see a reduction in healthcare costs due to innovation and growth of new ideas? That's the question from the audience, but I would also add, just as maybe a potential counterexample or a cautionary tale, in the US, our per capita expenditure on healthcare is sort of insanely rapidly increasing, even with a decent amount of innovation in the sector. Could it be that innovations end up increasing costs, and what does that mean for healthcare policy as well?
Well, I mean, I never use US as an example because US is a
fair enough.
No, I'm not saying in a bad way. It's a unique case. I mean, it takes a lot of explanation to explain why the country spends the highest percentage of the GDP in healthcare and it has least of achievements in terms of coverage of population with the health services. It's a really just 20 seconds on that. That all started to happen in the 50s. When the state pushed too much responsibilities over to the private insurance companies and large insurance companies, they became larger, bigger, and bigger and bigger. And then they started to pretty much come up with their own rules and regulations. Again, I'm not for the state regulations for everything. I'm just saying that they should have been not kept, but they should have been better managed. Let's put it that way. But it was really good because they got that financial burden off. And then when they started to try to catch up, it was a little bit too late into the game. So the US is not necessarily a good example when we talk about the organization. And then you have federal system, then you have states, then you have community, then you have counties. So it's a completely different story there. I don't think that I think the startups, again, if you look at the new technologies that have come out, not just in pharmaceutical business, but also in high tech, and they are probably, I was reading the other day somewhere, it was like 75% comes to the small startups that they start. And considering that there are companies, and especially in China, in South Korea, in other countries that have a big labor capacity to produce things very quickly from the prototype to actually start mass production, they've been really good at that. And innovations in general, they come for two in health. They come for two. They serve two purposes. Let's put it that way. So, since we are advancing in medical sciences, so we know how to treat people better. We have DNA. We know how to sequence DNA. Blah blah. A billion things, right? Then the concept of operating a medical facility, because this is something that people really forget, that from that innovation, the link goes all the way down to a facility. Okay, so the purpose or the goal of a facility is to not to keep a person in a hospital for too long. On the contrary, to treat them as fast as possible, release, and work on the turnover. That's why private health systems are good, because they will not keep you there if you need to be there. I mean, unless you, as someone, I can't remember who said that. I used this like a million times in my presentations, and I forgot. The concept is that there's no money in dead people, and there's no money in healthy people. There's money somewhere in between. So, once you have this process, and technology is the biggest contributing factor, both in pharmaceutical sciences and biotechnologies, and also in equipment. When you can treat someone fairly quickly, first of all, the whole idea is that not to get someone overly sick. I mean, this because then it becomes. I mean, we're talking about purely market values here. We're not talking about morals, right? To run the business. So what you need is not too sick person that could come into a hospital, whatever surgery or whatever they need to do, the level of complications that is out, let's say, in 5 days at most. Okay, or 3 days or 2 days. And you see the countries everywhere in the world, the countries are reducing the average length of stay, this is the special term, in hospitals to, again, maximize the turnover. So you don't need to build like 5,000 more hospitals and build more beds, but one can process more people. The simple things, for example, new technologies in disinfecting surgery rooms, you'll be surprised. And disinfection of instruments, they increase the number of surgeries by 40-50%. And of course, the state is not, these are the private companies and startups and small, tiny ones that actually come up with these amazing things, how to disinfect the entire room in 5 minutes, whenever, 10 years ago, people will go with brushes and clean it and spray some things. So there's a chain of contributing factors that makes two things, makes healthcare better. So you treat people faster and at a higher quality and with better results. You reduce the cost as a result of that, and you advance and you make your people healthier, they live longer, and they live happier and healthier ever after. So I think we'll see if in the 90s, and because of the development of different technologies, including big investments in, as I said, in higher technologies like space and Mars, and people say, well, why do we care about that? No, we do care about that. This is a good thing, because every time you go further, you come up with something new, then it's used in your everyday life. And healthcare is one of the biggest absorbers. Healthcare technologies are biggest absorbers of the new technologies come up in military, in in whatever sciences. Okay, so military is one of the biggest contributors, by the way. So from CT scans, they all came from there. So I think the role will increase. I think there'll be more. I think there'll be more investments and more money is going that way. Because if you look at the trend, if you look at the 90s, the biggest case was Pfizer, by the way, with Viagra. That was probably the biggest. I can't remember what the year was, at 99 or 98 or something like that. And since then, you don't really see much of this stories like that. But now with the vaccines, with the other stuff, there will be a lot more companies popping up and doing new innovative methods in both treatment and diagnostics.
I assume that these days, when healthcare experts and policymakers and economists get together for drinks, what they mostly talk about is, if I was in charge of the vaccination rollout, here's how I would do it. And we have a question. What is your take on Western countries and how they're currently dealing with vaccination? And was the central purchase unit created at the EU level a good idea?
Okay. There's yes and no. I hate this answer, but yes and no. Because
I'll allow you one yes and no, but now you
okay, that's it.
So
no,
from now on,
you,
it's definitive only.
The central purchasing agency or unit is beneficial for smaller countries with smaller population, because then you can combine. I can explain what I'm trying to say. If you remember back in 2009, I think there was the swine flu H1N1. Everybody was freaking out, and then all of a sudden this Tamiflu came out, which didn't really help, but everybody wanted to have it. I can't remember who was the maker of Tamiflu, but anyways, it was a big line of different countries, and of course the richer countries and bigger countries, because they were ordering more, And Pfizer is a very good example when the US has an order of 150 million doses until April of this year. So in 2 months, they have to get that much. And then you have, let's say, something like Georgia, trying to get 100,000 vaccines. Nobody even going to look at them. So when you centralize that, not central, for smaller countries, it does have a benefit. For larger countries, it doesn't. But what we have seen is actually an interesting story. It's not necessarily about this purchase unit, but it's an interesting story. Vaccination showed us, or at least me, the types of worldwide alliances that we live in. So if you're friends with Russia, you're going to get Sputnik. If you are friends with the Americans or Canadians, you're going to get Pfizer. If you are somewhere in the middle, in between, or maybe towards Western countries, Western Europe, you're going to get AstraZeneca. But if you are monkeying around and you're playing like a three-way game, then you're not going to get anything. So that's also the case. But no, to be serious, it could benefit smaller countries, but not necessarily large ones, because then they suffer from that. They can't never agree on the size and number and delivery and logistics and so forth. With the rollout, I've always said that, always when I spoke publicly, that it's not, vaccine production is an extremely important thing. Invention and then production at the levels that we need, but even bigger is the actual rollout of vaccination and vaccinating people. I'm not going to do much of a math exercise here, but just calculate this. And there were countries that made that mistake. It takes about 5 minutes to get a shot. So forget about it. Let's say it takes 5 minutes if you get inside the room where you're vaccinated. You're going to get vaccinated before they're going to ask a couple of questions, shot, and then you have to at least be there for 20 to 30 minutes unless there's some kind of complications, so you're treated at the facility. So the countries, some of them started very quickly, bringing in lines, whatever, and then they realized that, okay, you have 5 minute lag to go in, and then you have 30-minute lag to get out. So then their back rooms were filling up, and then vaccine doesn't work that very second when it's. So all of a sudden you have large rooms with a bunch of people sitting. Belgium actually had the problem with, I think, Belgium, if I'm not mistaken. And they had these large rooms where they had hundreds of people sitting and waiting for them to be released. So that's, and if you average the time to 15 minutes, then you can do your math. If you want to vaccinate 1 million people, how much time in cumulatively you'll need to do that? Okay, 15 times 1, 15 million minutes, right? I mean, roughly. Then you have to calculate how many spots you can have, and that's why in the US, for example, they do it at the stadiums. I don't know if you saw that. I was fascinated. They St. Louis, I think, they have these cars go in, and the nurses. This is great. I mean, this was my point from the very beginning. This situation will come up with solutions that were never seen before. Okay, who could imagine that people would get vaccinated at the stadium in their cars? I mean, that's not even pursuit. But I think every country will struggle with that. I don't think that anybody's going to hit the numbers they think, except smaller countries. Again, Israel is a good example of that, because they have all the vaccines, and they're doing it very, very properly. But larger countries will have bigger problems. Let's put it that way.
We have another question. It's about the FDA, but I think we could probably expand it a little more generally to authorizing bodies and bureaucracies that approve drugs in many countries. The FDA announced that drug makers would not need a new round of clinical trials with volunteers to test vaccines adapted to target new variants of COVID. Do you think this is a good sign of expediting future vaccine approvals? So I guess I would expand the question a little bit and say, I am always hopeful that what I am seeing are signs of a loosening of, regulatory regimes that have been overly strict, that the lesson that people will learn from COVID and from the approval process of the vaccines in particular is that this could have gone faster and that would have saved lives. Am I being too optimistic? And is our question asker being too optimistic to hope that some of this will be expedited in the future?
Well, once there are more makers and once the vaccine has been used around, I mean, of course, it'll be faster. But because, you have 3 or 4 technologies of making them, there's not going to be fifth. But I'm not a specialist in that, so I don't want to say something stupid. But it is important to do proper testing. And I'll tell you why. Because vaccine will not kill. I mean, that's for everyone to understand. Vaccine doesn't kill. It cannot possibly kill. What it can do, it cannot or may not work. which is as dangerous as killing after the vaccination. So if you have something that is not tested on a large strata of people on different ages groups and different genetic codes or whatever you want to call it, different nations, let's put it that way, it's harder it is to make sure that the vaccine will work on a larger group of population. And you have to understand the vaccines that we have up to now, forget about this COVID things, for Pfizer vaccines, whatever we've had, they've been tested for tens and hundreds, some of them, years. And every year or every 2 or 3 years, they're modified to respond to the new genetic strains of new viruses and so forth and so forth. So, and this process just started. Now, for other countries, and we pushed that in Ukraine, and we did that in Georgia, and some other countries have adopted that. And this is an important thing during this vaccination craze. In 2008, we pushed the so-called parallel import law for pharmaceuticals that concerned vaccines too, which meant that if a regulator, and we picked 5, so it was FDA, EMEA, Swiss agency, Australian agency, and Japanese, Japanese. If those regulators approved a product to be sold and used in their own markets, then Georgia would automatically allow it to come in. That helped us to reduce the prices for generics, for other drugs, people could go and just buy it and represent one paper that, this is exactly what it says that it is. Ukraine has gone the same path. Ukraine has, I think, 7 days regime of registration, which is also very fast. And that helped both, well, Georgia doesn't have any vaccines, but it certainly helped Ukraine to be able to quickly approve those that were already approved by the world's strictest and the most bureaucratic and the worst regulators in the world. Because I don't believe that in this global world, we have to build our own labs. I mean, Georgia will never be able to do it. Ukraine may be, but Georgia would never be able to, or Moldova. So why are you investing in something that other people are paying for, and then they say, okay, this ibuprofen is good enough for the Swede, so or Dutch, so it's not necessarily going to kill Ukrainian or Georgian or Moldovan or Belarusian. Okay, so but this also has implications on how quickly countries can buy and bring in and start using their vaccines. But I think, well, FDA is probably the toughest one because it takes the longest and it's most expensive thing. So I don't know. I mean, it's a tough question when it comes to vaccines, because that's something that you're talking about. We're not talking about some drug that you can then pull off the market and say, "Oops, it didn't work," or and okay, I'll pay 50 million in class action suit. This is not the same case. You may have millions of people that will be affected.
So we have about 5 minutes left, and so I just wanted to kind of ask one last question of my own, which is also inspired by an additional question in the chat. Which countries, from your kind of bird's eye view, do you see either as models or as countries that you're optimistic about in terms of their healthcare systems in particular? Where do you see sometimes in like movie reviews or book reviews, people say, "Oh, this is underrated." Can you say like what is an underrated country or a particular innovation somewhere that you think has a lot of promise and that people around the world could be copying?
Any country that has government that is leaning towards right is a lot more hopeful than the ones that is leaning to the left. The ones that have governments that count, and if it's small government, let's put it that way. Now, this is a very theoretical answer. It's really hard to figure out. I mean, things change. Georgia had a probably closest to the libertarian government in 2000, especially 7, 8, 9, and 10. And then there were elections. They left and you guys came, and they were more left-oriented, so things went around. So if there's a change there, for example, and I'm using examples that I know the best, right? then yeah, maybe we'll go back and be something promising. Because I've been traveling around the world from Rwanda to South Africa, and actually presenting Georgian healthcare reforms as a model that other countries could build. Countries in near Middle East, in Gulf countries, they all took some elements, and Rwanda was actually they took pretty much everything, all the Georgian reforms, not just healthcare, but the other ones. But now there's nothing to tell. So we're telling something that happened 12 years ago. I mean, this is really not appropriate anymore, or very important. So I don't know. It's very hard to say. I'm looking at I think that the rich countries will be the first ones that will start changing systems, because this COVID thing really hit them badly in understanding and realizing that the organization of the system is not good enough. You need to have wealth. I mean, can you imagine the resources that countries have to pull from testing to vaccination, plus deal with the economic hardships and downfall and downturn and losing the GDP? It's colossal. And again, I mean, that's simply because they were not well established. First of all, global cooperation on this kind of stuff. I mean, there are a lot of issues there, but and most of the healthcare systems were not good enough to hold up against this kind of pandemic, and that spread around the world. So people will be rethinking that, and not necessarily pouring gazillions of dollars in strengthening state healthcare. I don't believe in that. I think there will be some other models that will be coming up soon, and kind of building that bridge between private and state.
We'll end on that optimistic note in this challenging year. I really appreciate you taking a minute to speak with me, as well as to our crowd from Students for Liberty. And I just want to put in a plug for Reason Magazine, Reason Foundation. We have a lot of opportunities for students, including internships, job opportunities. Please feel free to get in touch with me directly, or just check out our website if that's something that might interest you. And I'm again really thrilled to have had the chance to have this conversation, and I guess I'll hand it back over to our organizer here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Katherine and Alexander. It was an amazing discussion, and we all enjoyed it so much. And thank you all who tuned in, and we will see you at our next event. Please stay tuned with our social media, with our website. We will have a lot of exciting events coming up in the next month. So we hope to see you all there.